that's where we are now. Gay men aren't hip enough for the gay pride parade. Compared to trans, gay is practically cis, and cis is practically Mormon. And this is a phenomenon we need to take into account when we look at this issue. Yes, part of the rise in LGBT numbers is from people feeling free enough to tell it to a pollster, and that's all to the good. But some of it is, it's trendy. Penis equals man? Okay, boomer. Remember, the prime directive of every teen is anything to shock and challenge the squares who brought you up. It's why nobody gets a nose ring at 56.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Enemies of My Country Saturday, December the 30th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, rules for retrogrades, rules for patriots, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, and the enemies of my country. All that and more, much more, when I come back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I shouldn't change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. Now, there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
We have always been concerned that economic education, a real understanding of how a market functions, will first and foremost help the most vulnerable. Obviously, what helps the poor is access to work. But as we looked into the good intentions of so many people, we see that a lot of them just think that solidarity with poor people means giving them things. And from our understanding of how markets function and from our understanding of human beings, you really find that human beings themselves are the producers of their own wealth and of their own way out of poverty. We must show how wealth is created and that the nature of people, even in the middle of their poverty, is to be creative and produce more than they consume. That's what's called wealth, when you produce more than you consume. Father Robert Sirico. An entire book could and should come from the sentiment of what Father Sirico expresses here. The poverty here comes from production, which means the cultivation of the human spirit manifested in skills and productive capacity. When one has the ability to produce, they have the capacity to generate wealth. Centering an economic worldview around consumption is man-focused in the most trite and simplistic of ways. But developing an entire ecosystem of thought and action around production, well, that honors the human person and opens the door to a sustainable, soul-giving eradication of poverty.
And that was There's No Free Lunch. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
Indeed, we can spin this train of argument out nearly ad infinitum. until we create a moral universe in which there is no morality whatsoever, except what we dictate. By positing the existence of rare or even imaginary creatures, we can bring down all of your society's defenses with the merest intellectual sleight of brain, and there is nothing you can do about it. Except, of course, come over to our side. Let me tell you where all your troubles started. Where you could have stopped us had you decided to fight, but where our willing accomplices in the Supreme Court overruled the will of the people and their duly elected representatives in two little decisions we like to call Engel versus Vitale and Abington Township School District versus Shemp, which, under the guise of the All-Purpose Establishment Clause, effectively moved the ball from the Christian court regarding establishment of one religious sect over all others. Where do you think the word anti-disestablishmentarianism comes from? To the atheist court. Suddenly, the argument was no longer about which version of Christianity, if any, was to be state-ordained or supported. Many of the original colonies had established churches, which laws lasted well past the adoption of the Constitution, such as the Congregational Church, the official state religion in Connecticut until 1818, and in now heathen Massachusetts until 1833. The notion that the Constitution requires a wall of separation between the state and religion is a load of hogwash that derives from Jefferson's 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptists, when said Danbury Baptists were suffering from being a non-established and therefore suspect religion in Congregationalist Connecticut. Here's the pertinent paragraph penned by the very first Democratic President of the United States, which has caused so much mischief for so long. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties. And then along came Madeline. If we had patron saints, she would certainly be one of them. Since the sainted Madeline Murray O'Hare, the Presbyterian turned warrior against God, arrived on the scene and began to break the stranglehold that religious superstition had on the body politic, we have waged unremitting warfare against your culture, missing nary an opportunity to hamstring you. What a magnificent legacy Ms. O'Hare has left us. Why, all you have to do is think about how things were in the public schools of the United States. Hint, racism, sexism, homophobia, senior smoking rooms, in the bad old days before the historic Murray versus Curlett lawsuit that culminated in the 1963 Supreme Court decision decided by an 8-1 vote, which forever banned school prayer and the reading of Bible verses in the nation's public schools. You wingnuts have been carping about this ever since. It was one of the reasons that back in my dad's youth, people wanted to impeach the Chief Justice, Earl Warren. But by now, if you just put aside your irrational rancor, you see what a good idea it has proven to be. Just think back to those post-war high schools, with all those clean-cut kids and the romantic rebels with their DA haircuts and muscle cars. Think back to the music of the period, to the way the girls looked in their bobby socks, the way the boys looked in their V-necked sweaters. Horrible, right? Now look at high schools today. Without wasting a lot of time invoking God, we can devote more time and money to metal detectors, to self-esteem classes, to lectures from cops about the dangers of drugs and weapons. Instead of hectoring their charges as if there were some sort of inherent power imbalance between students and teachers, we now have teachers in our urban jungles cowering in fear from their students, assaulted, beaten up, threatened. We have teachers' unions that can now devote themselves entirely to their real purpose, which is making sure that the teacher will never get fired. A small price to pay for having to endure the level of hostilities in the inner cities that a still racist society engenders. With God no longer in the classroom, the old taboos have flown out the window along with discipline, morals, and learning. If you'd wanted to destroy the public schools in the U.S., you couldn't have found a better tip of the spear than Madeline Murray O'Hare, which is why she enjoys such an honored place in our pantheon of heroes today. It matters little to us that Ms. O'Hare met an especially unfortunate, if dramatically satisfying end at the hands of a member of her organization, American Atheists. In 1996, she and 2 members of her family were kidnapped, robbed, tortured, and hacked into small pieces by one of her followers, a man named David Rowland Waters, who had previously embezzled $54,000 from the organization. Waters later died in prison. And you know what the best part is? As a lifelong committed atheist, she probably didn't feel a thing as Waters was torturing her, other than a few brief moments of physical pain as he severed her limbs and decapitated her. As we all know, psychological pain is far worse than physical pain. So I can state with a certainty that she was never troubled by the notion that there might be a life after death, that there might be some ludicrous supreme being awaiting her, there to sit in judgment of her stewardship of her life. No, there would be no judgmental big fellow with a clipboard, ready to ask her a bunch of unpleasant questions about her time on Earth, asking her to justify why she had changed the very relationship the vast majority of Americans had once enjoyed as part of their compact with the government. That in exchange for paying their property taxes and consigning their children to its tender mercies, the government would respect the larger culture and not seek to interfere with it or replace it with something alien. That both elements of the First Amendment's mention of religion would be equally respected. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. He would not be there going over her rap sheet, why she went through husbands and lovers, why she had tried to defect to the Soviet Union at its embassy in Paris, at just about the same time that another American atheist, Lee Harvey Oswald, was defecting to the Soviets as well, only to be turned away by the Russians. She wouldn't have had to worry that he might bring up the little unpleasantness involving her assault on some Baltimore police officers who were trying to restore a runaway girl who was seeing Madeline's son, Bill, and why she sued NASA when the Apollo 8 astronauts read from the book of Genesis as they orbited the moon, and why she functioned as pornographer Larry Flint's speechwriter during his 1984 presidential campaign. No, none of that would have been going through her mind as she died alongside her illegitimate son John and her granddaughter Robin, serenely confident that nothing but darkness awaited her, and that if her body was ever found, it would ultimately be identified by the serial number on her prosthetic hip. What a relief and a comfort the absence of a supreme being must have been to her in those final triumphant moments. No need to fear his powers of moral suasion, his threats against our way of life, or even the lurking fear of punishment that may or may not come only after the lights have long since gone out. When we look in the mirror, we see God, and that is good enough for us. It ought to be good enough for him, too.
And that was the end of Chapter 14 from Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rule 25 from Rules for Retrogrades.
Rule 25. The root of cultural decay is feminism. End feminism to end radicalism. The family is the building block of society. It is the wellspring and training ground of future generations. It is the natural setting where the virtues are learned: piety, morality, prudence, frugality, decency, etiquette, and every good thing for our youth. As the family goes, so goes society. It is precisely for this reason that the family has found itself under full-fledged radical assault in the past half-century. If radicals succeed in rending asunder the family, in re-educating our kids, they will have won the culture. This is why Vladimir Lenin boasted, "Give me just one generation of youth and I'll transform the whole world." The primary vehicle that radicals have used to undermine the family is feminism. It is a bald-faced lie that the purpose of feminism is to achieve equal rights for women. That's merely the party line, fed to the ignorant and the bitter. The animating purpose of feminism has always been the overthrow of the patriarchy, the headship of men in society, and particularly in the family. It is a little-known fact that, even as far back as the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, the coming-out party for first-wave feminism, the attendant bluestockings declared, quote, "The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpation on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her, and that, in the covenant of marriage, the wife is compelled to promise obedience to her husband, he becoming, to all intents and purposes, her master." Unquote. Empowering women legally and politically is, for feminists, but a mere means to end patriarchy. Once the rightful leaders of the family, fathers, are deposed, radicals know that they will be free to remake the family into an arm of their apparatus, or at the very least to dismantle it as a bastion of the old order. Like Maleficent from Sleeping Beauty, radicals fear nothing as much as the righteous, broad-shouldered man. However, patriarchy will not lightly be cast off. It has been willed by God from the beginning of creation. This is the reason why Adam had authority over Eve, as evidenced by him naming her, even prior to the fall, in the state of original justice. It's why God empowered Abraham, Noah, Moses, Aaron, and Joseph to guide his people. It's why Christ selected 12 men to be the princes of his church. It's why there continues to be, as a matter of Christian doctrine, an all-male priesthood. It's the reason why, throughout human history, quote, "There is not, nor has there ever been, any society that even remotely failed to associate authority and leadership in suprafamilial areas with the male," unquote. Footnote. That's by Stephen Goldberg from Why Men Rule, A Theory of Male Dominance. End of footnote. A rebellion against patriarchy is a rebellion against God himself. It's a rebellion against the order and intelligibility of the universe. As with other failed systems like Marxism, when man attempts to set aside human nature, the consequences are dire. For years, feminists have been attempting to subvert marriage and family life in an attempt to disrupt patriarchy. They have tasted a great deal of success in their endeavor. No-fault divorce has become the law of the land, yielding a marital attrition rate of about 50%. Abortion, which, quote, frees women from maternal duties, is legal and rampant, producing 57 million human casualties in the United States alone since 1973. Contraception, another insulator against the chief gift of marriage, children, is virtually ubiquitous, with 98% of sexually active women having used a contraceptive method at some point. Feminists have also taken to attacking motherhood, shaming housewives for being lazy and unambitious, and pressuring them to take up needless glamour careers for the sake of empowerment. Currently, 70% of women have abandoned minor-age children in exchange for careers outside the home, delegating mothering duties to disinterested nannies and sterile daycare centers. As Pope Pius XII once lamented, "When the mother is absent from the home, it becomes desolate for lack of care," with members, quote, "working separately at different hours in different parts of the city, and hardly ever meeting one another, not even for the principal meal or for the rest at the end of the day's work, much less for family prayers," unquote. Even in many otherwise functional traditional marriages, the wife, contrary to Scripture, e.g. Titus 2:5, 1 Peter 3:1-7, and reason, has usurped her husband's authority and headship over the family, resulting in a de facto leadership vacuum. Hen-pecked, uxorious men are now the rule. The foregoing feminist machinations have produced wages of the most fetid sort. The culture has quickly become crass and despondent. Drug addiction, pornography, violence, and crudity abound. Mass shootings, which are almost always perpetuated by young men from broken homes, are now routine. Of a recent sample of 56 school shooters, a scant 10 were raised in a home with both biological parents. Studies show that a father's absence increases antisocial behavior, such as aggression, rule-breaking, delinquency, and illegal drug use, especially among boys. Since 1999, the general suicide rate has increased by 33% in the United States. However, the female suicide rate has increased by 53% to the male's 26%. For people between the ages of 10 and 24 years old, the suicide rate increased by 56% in the 10-year span between 2007 and 2017. What's more, kids raised in a single-parent home are more than twice as likely to commit suicide as their peers raised in traditional homes. Even without poring over facts and figures, one can palpably sense that we're living in a time of general Western malaise. An unseen specter has long haunted us, sending a frisson down the spine of society. Feminism has failed to deliver even on its empty promises to women. In their paper, The Paradox of Declining Female Happiness, economists Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfers analyzed women's happiness trends between 1970 and 2005. To the surprise of many, they discovered that despite women's newfound liberation and progress, female contentment scores decreased every decade from the time the survey was administered. In other words, despite a spate of new legal rights and protections, women are less happy than they were in the dark days of widespread housewifery. In 1960, women's self-reported happiness was greater than that of men. By 2005, men were the happier sex. It's clear that we've been sold a defective product. Central as it is to the health of the culture at large, the family simply cannot be overlooked as the primary locus of the battle for the soul of society. Thus, if the retrograde is to rescue society from the clutches of radicals, he will have to do so by purifying and reinvigorating the family, the most noble and ancient of institutions. This necessitates that we discredit and decisively reject the saccharine hemlock of feminism and its contumacious rebellion against patriarchy. Men, rise up and grasp firmly the mantle of leadership in your homes. Insisting on wielding your God-given scepter of authority isn't bullying, it's your sacred duty. Hold fast to your wedding vows. Love your wives. Teach your kids diligently. But flee from any temptation to cede your rightful authority, giving way to a practical matriarchy. If we diligently attend to our families, providing for them, educating them, loving them, guiding them, and growing them, in one generation we will have taken back control of the culture from the deviants who have long plotted its demise.
And that was Rule 25 from Rules for Retrogrades by Timothy and David Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now from Steve Deese, Rules for Patriots.
Every time. The other side understands this, which is why they ruthlessly pursue their agenda and worldview with far less concern for public opinion than we do. We, on the other hand, want to debate, vent, wring our hands, or worse, nice the system to death. I especially see this among many of the Christian political circles I run in as a fellow Jesus freak. We're sending chaplains off to war when we should be sending soldiers trained to win the peace. The Bible says blessed are the peacemakers, but it doesn't say blessed are the peace lovers. Jesus himself said he came not to bring peace, but a sword. After all, is there a message more confrontational and offensive in all of human history than the gospel, which says you're evil, you crave and desire sin, and you wouldn't do what's right unless there was something in it for you? You deserve hell for breaking God's commandments, and it is hell you will receive unless you accept through faith the grace that is offered through the exclusive truth of the redemptive work of Jesus Christ. Now, if someone can think of a nice way to tell every human being that has ever lived what I just said, by all means, clue me in, because as someone that communicates for a living, I haven't discovered it yet. That might be why they hung Jesus on a cross and killed all of his apostles except one, whom they tried to kill by boiling him in oil, but he survived. America's largest Christian church and its nicest and most well-known pastor, Joel Osteen, are in Houston, Texas. Joel smiles a lot. Okay, he smiles an awful lot, like perpetually. It's kind of creepy, really, but hey, he's helping Americans find their best life now, so who am I to judge, right? But here's a question. If he and his church that is so large they have to meet in the basketball arena the NBA's Houston Rockets used to play in, were really preaching the full truth of the Bible, would their city have elected their first lesbian mayor in 2009? In fact, Osteen provided the prayer of blessing for the new lesbian mayor at her swearing-in ceremony. There is no biblical precedent in either the Old or New Testaments for a man of God enabling and validating that which God says is wrong so publicly. Jesus ate with sinners, but he died for their sins so they could be redeemed from their sinfulness, not blessed in it. If it's true the black-robed regiment of pastors preaching freedom and liberty from America's pulpits were instrumental in our victory in the war for independence, then it must also be true that too many of our pastors and pulpits are to blame for America's current nosedive towards Gomorrah and socialism by preaching watered-down self-esteem psychobabble. We can't have it both ways. As Alexis de Tocqueville once said, I sought for the key to the greatness of America in her harbors, in her fertile fields and boundless forests, in her rich mines and vast world commerce, in her public school system and institutions of learning. I sought for it in her democratic Congress and in her matchless Constitution. Not until I went into the churches of America and heard her pulpits aflame with righteousness did I understand the secret of her genius and power. America is great because America is good, and if America ever ceases to be good, America ceases to be great. That doesn't mean we look for needless ways to be offensive any more than it means a soldier in combat indiscriminately kills civilians without just cause. Soldiers that do so are rightfully court-martialed, and those of us that are recklessly destructive in politics should be similarly reprimanded. But war, if it's a just war, has been a constructive tool to administer justice and protect life, liberty, and property from the time Moses and Joshua commandeered the Israelites into the Promised Land. It was a just war that defeated Adolf Hitler. It was a just war that drove the redcoats from our shores. Just war should always be a last resort, but it should always be an available one when all other means are exhausted. However, even a just war comes with an all too real and tragic human toll. That's what is so unique about America's political system, despite all of its flaws. Most of the time in human history, when a society can no longer come to a consensus on the definition of its most basic institutions and rights, it leads to a coup d'etat or a civil war. Even our nation, which has the longest standing constitution in human history, has been unable to avoid such bloodshed in our past. Thankfully, we usually end up resolving these disputes at the ballot box nowadays with minimal casualties. With one exception. That would be the 50 million little babies massacred via abortion. And that number still escalating. Politics is a substitute for civil war, and it's also a variation of it. For further evidence, just look at the terminology we often use in talking about the nuts and bolts of politics, like a campaign war chest or propaganda. Those are terms of warfare. If the generations preceding the Civil War had been more principled in utilizing the political process to end the abomination of slavery, perhaps it would have never come to war, and the proper interpretation of the 10th Amendment protecting these United States from the endless encroachment of the federal government would have been preserved. The current understanding of federal supremacy over the states has its historical origins in the aftermath of the Civil War, as the federal government felt compelled to intervene on behalf of stopping the abomination of slavery. But now the feds call any assertion of the sovereignty of the states an excuse to impose further. Likewise, if those of us who believe in the American view, to borrow a phrase from my friends at the Institute of the Constitution, which is enshrined in the Declaration of Independence that there is a God, our rights come from him, and government's only duty and obligation is to protect those God-given rights. If those of us who believe that do not take advantage of the political process to restore the republic, then we may one day get another tragic reminder that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Throughout human history, there has never been a mass government intrusion into individual wealth, property, and civil rights without bloodshed. We are wired by our Creator for survival, and that survival instinct kicks in when our very survival is threatened. Historically speaking, people do not just sit there and take it while their freedoms are threatened, if they have other options. Case in point, anyone else notice the spike in the sales of firearms the past few years? And neither should we. But we are blessed to have methods and tactics at our disposal that allows us to fight wars to stop the shedding of blood, not perpetuate it. I believe we have a moral obligation to take advantage of that. But no war is won by nicing the enemy to death. To paraphrase George C. Scott's famous film portrayal of the legendary General Patton, you don't win a war by dying for your cause. You win a war by making the other son of a gun die for his. To make the other son of a gun die for his cause in politics, you have to beat him in the arena of ideas, and then casualties are inflicted at the ballot box. Notice I didn't say maiming or wounding. I said casualties. A maimed or wounded enemy is among the most dangerous. For now he has nothing to lose. But a dead enemy is a former enemy, gone and soon forgotten. In combat, you win by inflicting devastation and casualties upon your enemy on such a massive scale that you either annihilate them or they quit. That's why warfare requires a just cause, because if you can't morally justify that level of mass devastation, then do not go to war. Trying to fight it more amicably just gets more of your own and innocent bystanders killed. It is the same in politics. Right now in America, we have one side playing to win and another side playing not to lose. One side plays chess, the other side plays checkers. One side is fighting a war. The other side is posturing. Nationally, our side has been in a prevent defense pretty much since Reagan left office. And any good football fan knows the prevent defense just prevents you from winning. One notable exception would be the Republican Revolution of 1994. But that didn't last past 1996. George W. Bush won the presidency in 2007, but lost the popular vote to Al Gore, which is hard to do. He did it playing prevent defense with Karl Rove's empty, compassionate, conservative talking points. As we now know, Bush grew government more than any president in history up until that point, which eventually gave rise to true leftists like Nancy Pelosi as Speaker and Barack Obama as President. In that election, we won the battle, beating the Democrats, but lost the war, restoring the Republic. Then came 2010, and we took it upon ourselves to take on the system, cleaning house of several high-profile Republicans in primaries and firing over 700 Democrats nationwide during those midterm elections. But then once in office, some of those same grassroots conservatives we just got elected didn't take long to disappoint us. A 2012 Club for Growth study found that Tea Party freshmen voted as a group about the same as the more moderate GOP leadership we sent them there to challenge. Furthermore, CNS reported in June of 2012 the Republican-led House of Representatives increased federal spending more in less than one term of Congress than in the first 97 Congresses combined. Gutless Republican Speaker John Boehner always attempts to excuse his tomfoolery by saying they're just one half of one-third of the government. Except that's nonsense. The Constitution says that all appropriations, i.e. spending, begins in the House, which means the federal government is not allowed to allocate a penny of our money without first getting approval for it from the chamber Boehner presides over. Boehner and his colleagues could have thrown a monkey wrench into all of Obama's schemes if they wanted to, including the defunding of Obamacare and Planned Parenthood. There's a reason why the Speaker of the House is second in line to the presidency, because it's one of the most powerful positions in the U.S. government.
And that was the second part of Chapter 5, from Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again, by Steve Deese. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a part of or segment of the 33 Strategies of War.
Chapter 6. Segment your forces. The controlled chaos strategy. The critical elements in war are speed and adaptability, the ability to move and make decisions faster than the enemy. But speed and adaptability are hard to achieve today. We have more information than ever before at our fingertips, making interpretation and decision-making more difficult. We have more people to manage. Those people are more widely spread, and we face more uncertainty. Learn from Napoleon, warfare's greatest master. Speed and adaptability come from flexible organization. Break your forces into independent groups that can operate and make decisions on their own. Make your forces elusive and unstoppable by infusing them with the spirit of the campaign, giving them a mission to accomplish, and then letting them run. Calculated disorder. In 1800, by defeating Austria in the Battle of Marengo, Napoleon gained control of northern Italy and forced the Austrians to sign a treaty recognizing French territorial gains there and in Belgium. For the next 5 years, an uneasy peace held sway, but Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France, and many in Europe began to suspect that this Corsican upstart had limitless ambitions. Karl Mach, the Austrian quartermaster general and an older and influential member of the Austrian military, advocated a preemptive strike against France, with an army large enough to guarantee victory. He told his colleagues, "In war, the object is to beat the enemy, not merely to avoid being beaten." Mach and like-minded officers slowly gained influence, and in April 1805, Austria, England, and Russia signed a treaty of alliance to wage war on France and force her to return to her pre-Napoleonic borders. That summer, they formulated their plan. 95,000 Austrian troops would attack the French in northern Italy, redressing the humiliating defeat of 1800. Another 23,000 troops would secure the Tyrol between Italy and Austria. Mach would then lead a force of 70,000 men west along the Danube into Bavaria, preventing this strategically located country from allying itself with France. Once encamped in Bavaria, Mach and his army would await the arrival a few weeks later of 75,000 troops from Russia. The two armies would link up, and this unstoppable force would march west into France. Meanwhile, the English would attack the French at sea. More troops would later be funneled into each war zone, making for an army totaling 500,000 men overall, the largest military force ever assembled in Europe up to that point. Not even Napoleon could withstand an army more than twice the size of his own moving in on him from all sides. In the middle of September, Mach began his phase of the campaign by advancing along the Danube to Ulm, in the heart of Bavaria. Having established his camp there, he felt hugely satisfied. Mach loathed disorder and uncertainty. He tried to think of everything in advance, to come up with a clear plan and make sure everyone stuck to it. Clockwork warfare, he called it. He thought his plan was perfect. Nothing could go wrong. Napoleon was doomed. Mach had once been captured and forced to spend 3 years in France, where he had studied Napoleon's style of war. A key Napoleonic strategy was to make the enemy divide his forces, but now the trick was reversed. With trouble in Italy, Napoleon could not afford to send more than 70,000 French troops across the Rhine into Germany and Bavaria. The moment he crossed the Rhine, the Austrians would know his intentions and would act to slow his march. His army would need at least 2 months to reach Ulm and the Danube. By then, the Austrians would already have linked up with the Russians and swept through the Alsace and France. The strategy was as close to foolproof as any Mach had ever known. He savored the role he would play in destroying Napoleon, for he hated the man and all he represented. Undisciplined soldiers, the fomenting of revolution throughout Europe, the constant threat to the status quo. For Mach, the Russians could not arrive in Ulm too soon. Near the end of September, however, Mach began to sense something wrong. To the west of Ulm lay the Black Forest, between his own position and the French border. Suddenly, scouts were telling him that a French army was passing through the forest in his direction. Mach was bewildered. It made the best sense for Napoleon to cross the Rhine into Germany farther to the north, where his passage east would be smoother and harder to stop. But now he was yet again doing the unexpected, funneling an army through a narrow opening in the Black Forest and sending it straight at Mach. Even if this move were just a feint, Mack had to defend his position. So he sent part of his army west into the Black Forest to stem the French advance long enough for the Russians to come to his aid. A few days later, Mack began to feel horribly confused. The French were proceeding through the Black Forest, and some of their cavalry had come quite far. At the same time, though, word reached Mack of a large French army somewhere to the north of his position. The reports were contradictory. Some said this army was at Stuttgart, 60 miles northwest of Ulm. Others had it more to the east, or even farther to the north, or quite close, near the Danube. Mack could get no hard information, since the French cavalry that had come through the Black Forest blocked access to the north for reconnaissance. The Austrian general now faced what he feared most, uncertainty, and it was clouding his ability to think straight. Finally, he ordered all of his troops back to Ulm, where he would concentrate his forces. Perhaps Napoleon intended to do battle at Ulm. At least Mack would have equal numbers. In early October, Austrian scouts were at last able to find out what was really going on, and it was a nightmare. A French army had crossed the Danube to the east of Ulm, blocking Mack's way back to Austria and cutting off the Russians. Another army lay to the south, blocking his route to Italy. How could 70,000 French soldiers appear in so many places at once and move so fast? Gripped by panic, Mack sent probes in every direction. On October 11th, his men discovered a weak point. Only a small French force barred the way north and east. There he could push through and escape the French encirclement. He began to prepare for the march. But 2 days later, when he was on the point of ordering the retreat, his scouts reported that a large French force had appeared overnight, blocking the northeastern route as well. On October 20th, finding out that the Russians had decided not to come to his rescue, Mack surrendered. Over 60,000 Austrian soldiers were taken prisoner with hardly a shot fired. It was one of the most splendidly bloodless victories in history. In the next few months, Napoleon's army turned east to deal with the Russians and remaining Austrians, culminating in his spectacular victory at Austerlitz. Meanwhile, Mack languished in an Austrian prison, sentenced to 2 years for his role in this humiliating defeat. There he racked his brains, losing his sanity in the process, some said. Where had his plan gone wrong? How had an army appeared out of nowhere to his east, so easily swallowing him up? He had never seen anything like it, and he was trying to figure it out to the end of his days. Interpretation. History should not judge General Mack too harshly, for the French armies he faced in the fall of 1805 represented one of the greatest revolutions in military history. For thousands of years, war had been fought in essentially the same way. The commander led his large and unified army into battle against an opponent of roughly equal size. He would never break up his army into smaller units, for that would violate the military principle of keeping one's forces concentrated. Furthermore, scattering his forces would make them harder to monitor, and he would lose control over the battle. Suddenly, Napoleon changed all that. In the years of peace between 1800 and 1805, he reorganized the French military, bringing different forces together to form the Grande Armée, 210,000 men strong. He divided this army into several corps, each with its own cavalry, infantry, artillery, and general staff. Each was led by a marshal general, usually a young officer of proven strength in previous campaigns. Varying in size from 15,000 to 30,000 men, each corps was a miniature army headed by a miniature Napoleon. The key to the system was the speed with which the corps could move. Napoleon would give the marshals their mission, then let them accomplish it on their own.
And that was part 1 of Chapter 6, Segment Your Forces, from the 33 Strategies of War. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Bishop Robert Barron.
Your being increases in the measure that you give it away. Put that on your refrigerator. Live by it. Every instinct in us says, no, take things to yourself. Hang on to them. Hoard them. Keep them. Make sure you've got enough. People want some, keep them at bay. That's your possession. But that runs counter to the basic logic of the universe, because the creator of the universe is love. We say God is love. Love isn't something God does from time to time. It's not one of God's attributes. It's what God is, right through. Love, therefore, is the secret. Love is the great mystery, the hidden truth of all things. And the way it works is the more you give of your life, that's what love means, to will the good of the other, the more the divine grace increases in you. Peace be with you.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, the present state of our culture may be gauged by the extent to which principles have vanished from public discussion, reducing our cultural atmosphere to the sordid, petty senselessness of a bickering family that haggles over trivial concretes, while betraying all its major values, selling out its future for some spurious advantage of the moment. Unquote. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, a little bit of Maria Bartiromo on a Sunday on the Christmas Eve here.
Petition denied, I think, reflects that they saw what we all saw, which is that the very same Justice Department that said, hey, 6 years to consider charges against a guy named Biden was plenty fast. But when it comes to a guy named Trump, for some reason, we have to have this trial take place before the election. And keep in mind, Maria, that the speedy trial provisions of the Sixth Amendment are the defendant's right, not the government's right. And so
there we go. This illustrates the point that the government thinks it has rights, and that the objective or the goal or whatever of the judiciary is to balance rights and decide whose rights are paramount and why. And that's crap. The question is, and always with every case is, did the government, in exercising its authority, violate the rights of the individual? That's what the courts have to decide. That and only that, because the government has no rights. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now this is a little clip from Law and Order. Supreme Court
has recognized that there are certain areas of human existence that must remain free of governmental intrusion. Clearly, the most fundamental is the right of an individual to maintain his privacy.
And the courts have been willing to overlook such fundamental rights when there's been a compelling state interest to do so.
There we go. Compelling state interest. So what the judge is being asked to do here right now is balance rights. Because basically what the district attorney or assistant district attorney Stone is asking them to back government rights. He calls it a compelling state interest, but there is no such thing. The state has no compelling interest. The state has a certain amount of authority, limited, and a certain amount of responsibility, also limited. That's it. But compelling state interest is a code word for government rights, and the government has no such rights. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little bit of Maria Bartiromo on the 26th of December.
The president scolding the media over the weekend for the reporting of the impacts of Bidenomics on Americans. Watch.
About the economy, sir, what's your outlook on the economy next year? All good. Take a look. It's all reported the right way.
Doug, clearly we're not reporting it the right way. That's the problem, Biden.
So this is what the left trains everybody to do. They brainwash everybody to believe you as an individual don't have to change. You're fine. You're perfect just the way you are. And it is everybody else. It is the rest of the world that needs to change. Now, and that's a very attractive, initially a very attractive statement. It's a very attractive way of looking at things. That's what I'm looking to say. And so with Biden here, also what this in effect does when he says report it the right way, and they asked him, what is your outlook for 2024? Not your administration's outlook. So when it becomes him, it's him against the media. And so the media ends up looking like a bunch of bullies that are ganging up on this poor old man, okay, ginning up some sympathy amongst his supporters. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little bit of Stuart Varney.
It's Tuesday. Hope you had a great Christmas day yesterday. Let's begin this morning with this op-ed from the Washington Post. It reads, Harvard's Claudine Gay should resign. And guess what? It's from liberal columnist Ruth Marcus. My, oh my. Charlie Hurt joins...
And so asking her to resign, you would think it's because, the Washington Post and this liberal columnist, they finally get it. They finally understand how wrong this woman is. No. The reason that she's being asked to resign, that they're not going to say in the article, is because she's a drag on their movement. Because she ends up being a target, and they end up having to waste a lot of time trying to defend this woman. So a lot better for her to become a martyr. We throw her overboard and keep moving. That's what this is really all about. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, chapter 23 of The Enemies of My Country.
23. Joanne watched the Sapphire raid commence with a sense of sheer awe. She wasn't a stranger to viewing such proceedings. To the contrary, she couldn't have begun to estimate the number of live operations she'd seen unfolding, first during her staff time with SEAL Team 6 and then JSOC headquarters. But the sheer audacity with which these men routinely operated was mind-bending. They'd been wheels up on their helicopters within literal minutes of the plan being finalized, lifting off to roar across the Syrian desert on their way to the objective. And now, those aircraft were swarming into enemy-held positions in Sapphire. On one screen, a Black Hawk helicopter hovered over a rooftop as the team of assaulters expertly slid down fast ropes. On another, a massive Chinook was touching down in a field, twin lines of men racing off the open ramp and heading to separate buildings. The third screen showed a helicopter waving off its planned landing zone when enemy gunfire erupted from a nearby tree line. The aircraft flew a wide orbit out of the area, displacing to an alternate landing zone and clearing the area for an inbound bombing run. There was a strange order to the pandemonium, the threads of seamless military organization visible even amid the shifting maelstrom of multiple teams engaged in gunfights, clearing buildings, or moving toward secondary targets once they'd killed everyone at their primary objective. 2 Delta troops meant close to 40 shooters, supported by a full contingent of enablers, medics, dog handlers, and radio operators, each at the pinnacle of training and experience. When these hits occurred during the hours of darkness, as they usually did, their outdoor movement tended to be slower, more methodical, maximizing security under the benefit of the best night vision that money could buy. But this was a daylight raid, where any dickhead with a gun could see them plain as day from any window perch in the city. That meant the operators were moving like greased lightning to force their way inside and between buildings. 1 second, the structures were standing as they had on any other day. The next, they were being penetrated from multiple angles simultaneously by teams of armed men moving with impossible speed. Somewhere in between those two moments in time were the door and window breaches, which an observer would miss if they so much as blinked. Meanwhile, the entire OPSIN stood by to process intelligence that could lead to the rockets, with Duchess on split-second response to order all teams to consolidate to their location once found. But their wait went unanswered. One by one, the ground teams reported their objectives cleared, personnel accounted for, the number of enemy killed in action. A few men had sustained minor injuries, with a medical evacuation summoned for one who'd nearly been killed by an enemy hand grenade, but he had since been stabilized and was ready for transport. And over, Joanne heard the same two words at the end of the radio reports. No joy. No rockets located, no intelligence gleaned that would lead to a follow-on objective. They'd conquered their respective targets and killed 18 ISIS fighters, and that didn't include estimates of the fighter and attack pilots who'd executed air-to-ground strikes in the conduct of the mission. Joanne and Duchess had brought every available shooter to Sapphire, to say nothing of the massive logistical chain connecting exfil assets, quick response forces, and aircraft rotation for refueling and rearmament, and it had amounted to precisely nothing. Then the speaker box on Duchess's desk squawked with a new transmission. Duchess, this is Suicide Actual. This time, Duchess didn't pick up the hand mic as an afterthought. This time, the speed with which she replied indicated she'd realized the same two things Joanne had. First, the team leader referred to her by her personal call sign rather than that of the OPSIN, indicating that his transmission was of extreme importance. And second, whatever he was about to say likely represented their last chance of finding the rockets. Duchess here. Send it. Transmissions over captured enemy radio indicate cargo has been diverted to Ibrahim Kell. How copy? The timing of this information couldn't have been much worse, arriving on the heels of maximum expenditure of all military assets in the area. If they'd found out even 15 minutes prior, they could have redirected the strike force. Now, it would take a major muscle movement from every supporting asset to refit and transport the shooters. Duchess and Joanne immediately pulled up the village on their respective computers, and Duchess called out, "How long to relocate the strike force from Sapphire to Ibrahim Kell?" Sutherland said, "Between the medevac and refuel times for transport assets, they could hit the ground in 90 minutes, if we're lucky. I could get surveillance platforms online before that, but not by much." "Get them moving and shift all surveillance platforms to Ibrahim Kell," Duchess called back. "Everyone else, get to work building target packets for suspected cargo transfer points. Same drill as Sapphire." Joanne consulted the last reported location of David's team, unsure what she was supposed to feel about their current proximity to the city. On one hand, they could arrive in less than half the time it would take the strike force helicopters to land there. On the other, Gosweiler had expressly told her that all further action was to be military only. David spoke again. "Duchess, I say again, cargo routed to Ibrahim Kell. How copy?" "I copy all," she replied. "The strike force will need an hour and a half to consolidate and move there before they can action targets." The team leader's response was almost smug. "And fancy that, we're just under an hour away. Advise my team proceeds to Ibrahim Kell to reconnoiter for cargo location in advance of strike force arrival. We'll be continuing mission in 2 captured ISIS trucks, so please see to it that we don't get smoked in a coalition airstrike." He said the word advise as if he were speaking an order, and rather than be irritated, Duchess instead seized the opportunity to usurp Senator Gosweiler for the second time in 5 hours. "Negative. My orders are to exfil you ASAP," she transmitted back, quickly adding, "However, since the strike force is rerouting to Ibrahim Kell, I assessed that as the safest spot for exfil. Proceed there and—" She inserted some strategic pauses. "Stand by for link up and exfil." There was a long pause as the team leader interpreted the tone and spacing of Duchess's order. Joanne felt a wave of frustration at Duchess's insubordination, but she had to hand it to the woman. This wasn't her first time bending the rules. Neither her tone nor the pauses between words would be discernible on the transcript of communications emerging in the aftermath of the mission, but both may as well have been a direct order for the team leader to proceed into Ibrahim Kell as recon element for the strike force, just as he'd recommended in the first place. At least, Joanne thought, if the team leader was as perceptive as she suspected. Copy all. We're en route and we'll be standing by for further guidance regarding link-up and exfil. Continuing to monitor enemy radio frequency. We'll advise if we hear any intel. Suicide out. Duchess set down the hand mic, looking pleased that her unspoken order had been sufficiently received. Joanne said, "Well, that was clever, wasn't it?" "Yeah. The only thing missing was one of you pretending to have radio issues. But this is a bad idea. The thought hadn't occurred to me. I'm serious." Duchess tapped a fist against her opposite palm. "Gosweiler is already sending me to some outpost in the Arctic Circle to steam open envelopes until I retire. Let me worry about the fallout." "Senator Gosweiler," Joanne replied angrily, "could shut down Project Longwing in its entirety as a result of this. This calls into question the agency's ability to operate within very specific guidelines. It's not just about you anymore. It never was just about me. If Bari Khan makes it out of Syria with the cargo, it doesn't matter whether we protect Charlottesville or not. The analysts haven't found evidence in support of a terrorist attack in Charlottesville. Not yet," Duchess said. "And so what? Bari Khan could use them anywhere in the world, and depending on where he points those rockets, we could be looking at the highest casualty terrorist strike in history. And I'm not ending my command of this program until I've done everything in my power to stop that from happening."
And that was Chapter 23 of The Enemies of My Country by Jason Casper. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.